The argument from morality has been around for eons, showing a particular rise to prominence during the 18th century thanks to Immanuel Kant, and then again in recent years thanks to William Lane Craig. Damn it, Craig. Because of this, it's Craig's version that we're going to eviscerate in this video, and so brace yourself, my friends, the haters are coming. This is the argument from morality debunked. When debating with a theist, there are certain subjects that are bound to come up, and morality is most certainly one of them. It is of course raised in numerous ways, but it almost always boils down to the assertion that if there isn't a God, then there is no objective and absolute morality. That murder is only immoral because we currently agree that it is immoral. Or as Craig puts it in his book titled On Guard, in a world without God, who's to say whose values are right and whose are wrong? There can be no objective right and wrong, only our culturally and personally relative subjective judgments. This, in essence, is Craig's mantra on morality. And unlike many apologists, he's been kind enough to provide us with a syllogistic rendition of his assertion. And it is this syllogism that we're going to debunk in this video.
If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists.
Before we proceed to debunk Craig's moral argument, I want to make it clear that Craig does not, all of the time, commit all of the following flaws and fallacies, but rather he commits each of the following flaws at different times, and the same goes for those who use his moral argument. With that said, the first flaw I'd like to raise is that premise 1 is completely unsubstantiated, making the entire argument a non-sequitur. It in no way logically follows that only a specific God can be responsible for the existence of objective moral values, unless the proponent is literally defining objective moral values to mean moral values, principles and duties that are declared by God. And if they are doing this, then they are including the claim of their argument within their premise, which is begging the question. To illustrate this further, simply replace the word God with Cthulhu, and you'll quickly appreciate how absurd this argument is. It's either a non sequitur or it's begging the question. A second flaw that Craig's moral argument commits, and one that is subtle but completely devastating, is an equivocation fallacy. To put it as bluntly as possible, during his first premise, Craig and his argument uses a definition of the term objective moral values that is, for all intent and purposes, the definition of absolute moral values. That is, moral values, principles and duties that are universally valid and true unconditionally and under all circumstances. But during his second premise, he uses a definition of the term objective moral values that is, moral values, principles and duties that exist independent of human opinion, but may vary according to context and circumstance. Hence, Craig's moral argument is incoherent and therefore invalid. Either this, or Craig and his argument are exclusively using the first definition or the second definition of objective moral values for both of his premises. And if he is using the first definition, then his first premise is entirely false, because there are many types of morality that are absolute that don't insist on his specific God's existence, such as the deontological ethics of Kant's categorical imperative, some forms of the Golden Rule, and of course, competing forms of divine command theory. These objective moralities exist, period. The question is whether or not their foundations are substantiated, as is this the question for Craig's specific divine command theory. And if Craig is using the second definition of objective moral values for both of his premises, then, again, the first premise is entirely false, because, again, there are many types of morality that are objective in this way. That is, they have an objective reference point, a reference point that exists independent of human opinion. For example, just as consequentialism uses the objective reference point of potential consequences, and just as the moral landscape uses the objective reference point of the well-being of conscious creatures, Craig uses the objective reference point of his specific interpretation of Christianity, which is ironically subjective, not objective. Hence, Craig and his argument either commit an equivocation fallacy or his first premise is entirely false, with either of which resulting in the obliteration of his argument. But here's where things get really quite interesting. Craig has frequently stated that he doesn't use the term absolute moral values because
to say they're absolute moral values could be taken to mean that certain moral duties hold regardless of the circumstances you're in. So thou shalt not kill regardless of the fact that a terrorist is about to kill your wife and children.
And he frequently states that he deliberately uses the term objective morality, stating that objective moral values mean
that in any given situation in which you might find yourself, there is something that is really right and really wrong, independently of human opinion. But clearly that might vary with the circumstances. In some cases it would be morally permissible to kill, but in other cases it would be morally impermissible to kill. So what I'm talking about is objective right and wrong, but not necessarily absolutes that take no cognizance of the circumstances in which a person finds himself.
But listen carefully to the following clip of him explaining objective moral values to a different audience.
What we're talking about here are unconditional obligations or unconditional goods or evils. Yes, I think that there clearly are. For example, it's unconditionally good to be a loving and generous person. And I think that when most of us reflect on our moral experience, we do see that there is a clear, objective, unconditional difference between modes of behavior.
Sorry, Craig, but did you just say that it's unconditionally good to be a loving and generous person? That, for example, if a terrorist was about to kill your wife and child, you would have to be loving and generous towards him unconditionally, i.e., regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the fact that he's about to kill your wife and children. Because, as you have stated many times before, that's an absolute statement, not an objective or relative one. This, my friends, is how you play tennis without the net. And this is a prime example of Craig either intentionally or unintentionally committing an equivocation fallacy. Now, if I'm honest, the 3 flaws that we've just covered are each more than enough to destroy Craig's moral argument. But for what it's worth, here's a few additional ones. It might be subtle, but Craig and the proponents of his moral argument very often commit an argument from ignorance. They do this because they implicitly assert, and sometimes explicitly, that only their very specific God could be responsible for the existence of objective moral values, without justifying why this is the case. In fact, they often state,
take away God, and what basis then remains for objective moral duties?
Which translated from fluffland to English means, we don't know, therefore God. My very specific God. A 4th major flaw that Craig's moral argument commits, and one that shares a strong relationship with the argument from ignorance, is the shifting of the burden of proof. In their assertion that, if not who, then what, they are very clearly trying to switch the burden of proof, because they are indirectly asserting that if you can't account for objective moral values, then their assertion must be true. Which isn't just ludicrous, it's actually a subtle black and white fallacy. But don't get me started on that one. And finally, as the last flaw that I'll raise in this video, we have the fact that Craig's moral argument doesn't support monotheism. Even if objective moral values existed in the way that Craig insists, this wouldn't even suggest, let alone prove, that a single God is responsible. There is no reason to rule out the possibility that many gods are responsible. And in fact, there is no reason to rule out the possibility that many petulant and childish gods were responsible that have since died. The point being, Craig's argument supports theism, not monotheism, and certainly not his specific monotheism. Of course, Craig uses additional arguments to try and justify his specific monotheism, but the case in point here being is that his argument does not. Now of course, depending on the proponent of Craig's moral argument, there are many more flaws and fallacies that they commit. But so far as I can tell, we've covered the main ones here, and certainly enough to bury Craig's presentation of it. So, to recap, Craig's moral argument is flawed because Craig and his proponents either commit a non-sequitur fallacy or a begging the question fallacy. They commit an equivocation fallacy, and sometimes many. They commit an argument from ignorance. They attempt to shift the burden of proof. And the argument doesn't support monotheism, and certainly doesn't support the proponent's specific monotheism. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and I just want to say an extra special thank you to my kind patrons. Thank you. And here's an overwhelmingly powerful argument to consider. If you're not subscribed to my channel, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, you've subscribed to my channel.